My friends, if you were to ask a man what he desires most in life, he might say wealth, success, love, or happiness. He may not even hesitate before answering. But have you ever noticed that those who seek these things above all else often end up with none of them? The one who chases happiness finds it slipping through his fingers. The one who makes success his God is never satisfied, for there is always another mountain to climb, another rival to outdo. If you were to walk through any bustling city, listen in on the conversations of men and women, or observe the endless stream of advertisements vying for your attention, you would quickly notice a common theme. The world is always whispering, and often shouting, that you must pursue wealth, power, success, or personal happiness above all else. It presents these things as the highest good, the ultimate aim of all human striving. From the moment a child begins to understand the language of adults, he is taught directly or indirectly that life is about getting ahead, making something of oneself, and achieving as much as possible. And yet, if you were to stop and ask those who have reached the heights of worldly success, who have gathered more wealth than they can spend, who have seen their names written in lights and their faces admired by millions, if you were to ask them, "Are you satisfied?" you might be surprised at how many hesitate before answering. There is a reason that those who chase after worldly things so often find themselves unfulfilled. It is not because wealth, success, or pleasure are inherently evil. Far from it. It is because they were never meant to be the ultimate goal. They were never designed to bear the weight of our deepest longings. A man who drinks salt water to quench his thirst will find himself more parched than before. In the same way, the more we seek after earthly things to satisfy our souls, the more we find ourselves wanting. The hunger grows rather than diminishes. What once seemed like it would bring complete joy turns out to be only a fleeting moment of pleasure, followed by the same aching void. The world is filled with people who have spent their lives climbing ladders only to realize, too late, that the ladder was leaning against the wrong wall. They spend their youth chasing after careers, possessions, and recognition, believing that just a little more will finally bring them peace. But when they arrive at the top, they find that the view is not as they imagined. The applause of men fades quickly, the satisfaction of achievement is short-lived. The things they worked so hard for, money, influence, status, often come with burdens they never expected, and worst of all, they realize that the happiness they were chasing was always just out of reach. Consider the man who devotes his life to wealth. He sacrifices time, relationships, and health in pursuit of riches, believing that once he reaches a certain number in his bank account, he will finally feel secure. But security never comes because there is always more to earn, always another threat to guard against, always the fear that what has been gained can be lost. No matter how much he acquires, it is never quite enough. The rich man still worries at night. Or think of the one who pursues success above all else. He rises early, works tirelessly, and outshines his rivals. He earns the admiration of the world, but in the quiet of his own heart, he wonders why the satisfaction is so brief. He must keep proving himself. One failure, one moment of weakness, and the world may forget him. His achievements, impressive as they are, demand constant maintenance. They do not provide rest. They demand more effort. Even those who chase happiness directly, those who live for pleasure and comfort, find that the pursuit itself becomes exhausting. The thrill of indulgence wears off quickly, and what once satisfied becomes dull and unimpressive. They must always seek the next excitement, the next distraction, because the last one did not last. What was once enough no longer is. The feast leaves them starving. And so the great irony of life is that the more we chase after these things as our highest good, the less we actually enjoy them. A man who makes pleasure his God will not find it. A man who seeks only his own success will find that it never truly satisfies. The things of this world, when placed in the wrong position, become burdens rather than blessings. They are good servants but terrible masters. But why is this the case? Why do the things we long for most, when pursued above all else, leave us empty? The answer is simple. We were made for something greater. Our hearts were not designed to be filled by temporary things. They were made for eternity. To place anything at the center of our lives other than what we were created for is to guarantee frustration, restlessness, and disappointment. We are like travelers trying to build a home on shifting sand, wondering why the foundation never holds. The longing in our hearts is not a mistake. It is not an error in our design. It is a clue. It is the signpost that points us to something beyond this world, something deeper, something lasting. If we would only stop for a moment and recognize that the hunger we feel is not for more of the same, but for something entirely different, we might finally begin to understand. This captures Lewis's tone: rational, metaphor, rich, and gently persuasive. Let me know if you'd like any refinements. There is a strange and quiet irony in the way the world operates. It offers 1,000 things to chase, yet all of them slip through our fingers like sand. Wealth vanishes, reputations fade, youth withers, and even the strongest of men are eventually brought low. It is a strange thing indeed that we invest so much of our time and energy into things that do not last, as if we have forgotten that we ourselves are not permanent fixtures in this world. We build, we plan, we accumulate, and yet the story of history is filled with the ruins of once great empires, the forgotten names of once famous men, and the dust of things once thought indestructible. The tallest buildings, the grandest monuments, the most powerful rulers, all have crumbled in time. And yet, in the face of all this impermanence, there is something in us that longs for permanence. We want security, assurance, something that will not fail us, and so we cling to whatever seems most stable, whatever gives the illusion of lasting. But illusions have a way of breaking. The person who places his trust in wealth will find that fortunes can be lost overnight. The one who builds his identity on success will see that failure can come unexpectedly. The one who depends on the love of others for his happiness will realize that human affection is fickle. The things we trust in most can betray us, not because they are bad in themselves, but because they were never meant to hold the weight of our ultimate trust. There is only one thing that does not change, one thing that does not fade, one thing that does not wither with time, and that is God Himself. He is the foundation that cannot be shaken, the rock that does not crumble, the well that never runs dry. Every other thing that we rely on is subject to decay, but He alone remains steadfast. He does not break under pressure, does not waver with shifting tides, does not disappoint like the fleeting promises of the world. When we build our lives upon Him, we are not at the mercy of changing circumstances. We do not have to fear that we will be left with nothing, because what we have in Him is not something that can be taken away. This does not mean, of course, that life will be free of difficulty. It does not mean that we will never face loss, hardship, or pain. But it does mean that when the storms of life come, and they will come, we will not be swept away with them. A house built on sand may look just as beautiful as one built on rock, but when the rains fall and the winds rage, the difference becomes painfully clear. The world teaches us to construct our lives on shifting sand, to trust in things that cannot hold, and then seem surprised when people are left standing in the wreckage of their misplaced hopes. But those who build on the unshakable foundation of God find that no matter how fierce the storm, they are not destroyed. There is a peace that comes from knowing that what you trust in cannot be taken from you. It is a rare thing in this world. Most people live in a constant state of anxiety, clutching tightly to the things they believe will bring them security, terrified that they might lose them. The businessman fears economic collapse. The celebrity fears fading into obscurity. The athlete fears the day his strength will fail him. Even those who appear to have everything are often filled with dread, for they know how quickly everything can change. But the one who trusts in God need not fear. He does not cling to what can be lost because what he has is eternal. This is not a distant or abstract idea. It is the most practical thing in the world. When we understand that God is the only unchanging thing, we begin to live differently. We are no longer slaves to the pursuit of temporary things. We do not have to grasp at them desperately because we know they are not our ultimate hope. We can hold them with open hands, thankful for them, but not dependent on them. And when they fade, as all things eventually do, we do not despair because our foundation remains. If we truly understood this, how much fear would disappear from our lives? How much worry would vanish? How much of our striving, our grasping, our endless chase for security would cease? We spend so much of our lives trying to hold on to what was never meant to last, and in doing so, we miss the one thing that will never fail us. The invitation is always before us, but it requires that we let go of our illusions of control, our belief that we can find lasting security in things that are, by their nature, temporary. It requires us to trust, not in the shifting sands of the world, but in the rock that does not move. And here is the great paradox. When we do this, we do not lose what is good, but we finally gain what is best. The one who lets go of his grip on temporary things does not find himself empty-handed, but free. Free from the constant fear of loss, free from the need to prove himself, free to live, not in anxious striving, but in quiet, because he knows that the thing he has built his life upon will not fail him. There are few things more difficult than asking for something in earnest and receiving no response, or worse, receiving the opposite of what was hoped for. It is easy to trust when prayers are met with quick and obvious answers, when the doors open effortlessly, when the sickness lifts, when the burden is removed. But what of the times when the answer is silence, or when the very thing we feared is what comes to pass? It is in these moments that doubt creeps in, whispering that perhaps God does not listen after all, or that if he does, he is unmoved by our needs. Yet this is only because we assume that every unanswered prayer is a kind of divine neglect rather than divine protection. A child does not always understand why his parents refuse him the things he so desperately wants. He asks for sweets before dinner and is denied. He asks to stay up late and is sent to bed. He asks to play in the street and is pulled away from danger. At the time, these refusals seem nothing but cruelty. The child does not see the decay that sugar will cause in his teeth, the exhaustion that will follow from too little sleep, or the accident that might come from playing in the road. He only sees the desire of the moment and the refusal that frustrates it. So it is with us. We assume that because we cannot see the danger, it must not exist. We believe that what we ask for is good for us simply because we want it, never considering that there may be consequences beyond our sight. And when God, in his perfect wisdom, withholds what we desire, we call it an unanswered prayer, though in truth, it is the most loving answer we could have received. Many of us, if we are honest, can look back on our lives and see moments when we prayed for something with great urgency, only to realize much later that it was a mercy we were denied. There are relationships we begged to keep that would have led to heartbreak, jobs we pleaded for that would have drained the life from us, situations we fought for that would have stripped us of the very peace we were seeking. At the time, we were certain that what we asked for was best. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we see that the thing we so desperately wanted would have led to ruin. How many times have we been spared from unseen disaster, all because God in his love chose not to give us what we thought we needed? But what of those prayers that seem to go unanswered, not because they would lead to harm, but because they are good, even noble? A mother prays for her sick child, but the sickness does not leave. A man prays for work to provide for his family, yet the opportunity does not come. A woman prays for peace, yet she remains in the midst of hardship. These are not selfish requests, nor do they stem from greed or folly, and yet even these are sometimes met with silence. What then can be said? If God does not grant even the good things we ask for, is it because he does not care? It is a hard truth, but a necessary one, that we were never promised ease in this life. Nowhere are we told that faithfulness guarantees a smooth path, nor that every sorrow will be swiftly lifted from our shoulders. Even Christ himself in the Garden of Gethsemane prayed that the cup of suffering might pass from him, and yet he was not spared the cross, not because the Father did not love him, but because the suffering itself was the means by which redemption would come. If even the Son of God was not exempt from suffering, how can we expect that we should be? Sometimes what seems like an unanswered prayer is in fact the shaping of something far greater than what we asked for. The loss that breaks us becomes the very thing that softens our hearts toward others who are hurting. The delay that frustrates us teaches us patience we never would have learned otherwise. The hardship that we plead to be removed strengthens us in ways we could not have imagined. We pray for relief, but sometimes it is endurance that God chooses to give us instead. And in the end, we find that it was not a lesser answer, but a greater one. Perhaps the greatest mistake we make in prayer is assuming that God's love is proven by how often He says yes to us. But true love does not always give what is asked for. It gives what is best. And so when we find ourselves faced with prayers that seem unanswered, we must ask ourselves, do we trust in our own understanding more than we trust in His wisdom? Do we truly believe that His love is greater than our momentary desires? If we do, then we can rest in the assurance that even when God says no, even when He is silent, He is never absent. His love is always at work, even in the things we do not understand. And in time, we will see that the prayers we thought had gone unanswered were, in fact, answered in ways far beyond what we could have imagined. Many people approach prayer as if it were a kind of divine transaction. We come to God with our requests, our needs, our burdens, and in return, we expect Him to grant what we have asked. This is, after all, how human relationships often work. When we ask for help from a friend, a parent, or even a stranger, we anticipate a response, some sign that our request has been heard and considered. And yet, prayer is not merely a request for things, it is an invitation into relationship. The purpose of prayer is not only to receive, but to draw near. A child who speaks to his father does not do so only to ask for things. Certainly there are times when he asks for a toy, for a treat, for permission to do something he enjoys, but if his father were only a source of gifts and nothing more, the relationship would be shallow and transactional. A child also speaks to his father because he delights in his presence, because he finds comfort in his voice, because he trusts in his love. He does not measure the quality of the relationship by how often he receives what he asks for. Rather, he knows he is loved simply because his Father is near. And so it is with us and God. If we believe that prayer is only a means to get what we want, then unanswered prayers will shake our faith. We will come to think that God has abandoned us, that He is inattentive or indifferent. But if we understand that prayer is about communion with God above all else, then we will not be so easily troubled when His answers do not come in the way we expect. For in prayer, the greatest gift is not the thing we ask for, but the one to whom we pray. There are moments when a person kneels before God with a desperate heart, asking for clarity, for relief, for guidance, and receives nothing but silence. This silence can be unsettling, even painful, but it is in these moments of silence that we are invited to seek God for Himself, rather than simply for His gifts. Imagine two friends sitting together in quiet companionship. They do not need to speak to know that the other is there. The comfort is not in the words, but in the presence. The same is true of prayer. When we bring our requests before God and receive no immediate answer, it is not because He is distant, but because He is drawing us into deeper trust, teaching us to find peace not in what He gives, but in who He is. Many people find themselves disappointed in prayer because they come seeking solutions rather than presence. They want problems solved, burdens lifted, and paths made clear. And while there is nothing wrong with bringing these desires before God, indeed we are invited to do so, it is dangerous to measure the success of prayer only by whether we receive what we want. Prayer is not meant to be a way to control God, to bend His will to ours, or to force His hand. It is meant to align our hearts with His, to bring us into closer fellowship with Him, and to teach us to trust even when we do not understand. There is a subtle transformation that takes place in a person who prays, not only to ask, but to abide. At first, we may come to God with nothing but our needs, listing them off as if submitting a request form. But over time, if we persist in prayer, something begins to change. We find that what we once thought was most important, our own desires and plans, begins to fade in comparison to the peace that comes simply from being with Him. We begin to trust that even when we do not receive what we asked for, we are not forgotten. We begin to realize that the true purpose of prayer is not to change God's mind, but to change our own hearts. It is worth considering how often we pray only when we are in need. If prayer is only an emergency measure, a last resort, when all else has failed, then it is no wonder that we struggle when the answers do not come as we wish. Imagine a child who speaks to his parents only when he wants something from them. Such a relationship would be thin, lacking in depth or warmth. A loving relationship is not built solely on requests and responses, but on the steady companionship of knowing the other is near. So it is with prayer. If we only come to God when we need something, we miss the greater invitation, the invitation to know Him, to walk with Him, to rest in His presence. And when we begin to see prayer in this light, we find that even in the moments when the answer is unclear, when the response is delayed, when the silence lingers longer than we would like, we are not left empty-handed. For the greatest answer to prayer is not a yes or a no, but the unshakable assurance that we are not alone. 3. There is a particular kind of doubt that arises in the hearts of those who pray earnestly, and yet feel as though their prayers have not been answered. It is the doubt that asks, does God truly care for me? It is one thing to believe in God's power, to acknowledge that He is capable of answering any prayer, that nothing is beyond His reach. But it is quite another to trust in His love when the answer does not come in the way we had hoped. Many find themselves caught in this struggle, not questioning whether God exists, nor whether He is able, but whether He is willing, whether He is attentive, whether He is truly concerned with the details of our lives. This doubt, more than any other, shakes the foundation of faith. To understand the way God answers prayer, we must first understand the nature of His love. Love, as many suppose, is simply the giving of good things, the removal of pain, the granting of comfort and ease. But this is only a shallow imitation of true love. A parent who truly loves his child does not give him everything he desires, nor does he remove every difficulty from his path. He knows that to do so would not cultivate strength, wisdom, or maturity, but rather selfishness and weakness. If a father indulged every whim of his child, shielding him from all struggle, giving him every pleasure, he would not be acting in love, he would be acting in negligence. True love does not always give what is wanted, but what is needed, and sometimes what is needed is hardship, discipline, and waiting. If we apply this understanding to God's dealings with us, we begin to see that unanswered prayers are not evidence of His neglect, but of His fatherly care. It is not indifference that causes Him to withhold certain things from us, but wisdom. He sees what we do not. He knows what we cannot. He is not governed by our fleeting desires, but by His eternal purpose for us. And because He loves us perfectly, He does not grant every request, nor does He always intervene to remove every sorrow. Instead, He walks with us through them, shaping us in ways we would not choose for ourselves. There is something deep within human nature that resists this idea. We do not like to think of suffering as being allowed by a loving God. We prefer to believe that love should remove pain rather than allow it, and yet, when we look at the lives of those who have walked most closely with God, We do not find stories of uninterrupted comfort and ease. We find struggle, we find perseverance, we find faith that has been tested, refined, and strengthened, not in the absence of hardship, but in the midst of it. The greatest saints, the most faithful believers, the ones who have left behind the deepest legacies of faith, were not those whose lives were free from difficulty, but those who learned to trust God even when they did not understand his ways. When we pray and do not receive the answer we long for, we are faced with a choice. We can allow doubt to take root, believing that God has forgotten us, that he is distant or unfeeling, or we can choose to trust in his love even when his ways are beyond our understanding. Trust is not the result of seeing every step clearly, nor of having every question answered. Trust is what happens when we come to believe in the character of the one who holds our lives in his hands. It is in this trust that we find peace, even when circumstances remain unchanged. A person who has learned to trust in God's love does not measure his care by whether or not his desires are met. He does not assume that suffering means abandonment. Instead, he rests in the knowledge that God is always working, even when his hand is unseen, and in this resting, he finds a deeper kind of joy, a joy that is not dependent on circumstances, but on the unshakable reality of God's presence. One day, when we look back on our lives, we will see with clearer vision the ways in which God was answering our prayers all along. We will see that the things we thought were signs of his neglect were in fact evidence of his love. We will recognize the wisdom in his refusals, the mercy in his silences, the faithfulness in his delays. And we will realize that he was never indifferent to our cries, but that he was always leading us towards something greater than we could have imagined. Until that day, we walk by faith. We pray, we trust, and we wait, not because we always understand, but because we believe in the goodness of the one who hears. And that belief is enough to sustain us even when the answers do not come as we had hoped. For we do not place our hope in the granting of every request, but in the unfailing love of the God who holds all things in his hands. It is a difficult thing to wait. Few of us enjoy it. We live in a world that values immediacy, that encourages us to expect instant results, quick solutions, and effortless gratification. When we do not receive what we ask for in the time we desire, we grow restless, frustrated, even disheartened. This impatience does not only apply to the small inconveniences of life, but also to the deep and weighty matters of the heart. When we pray for something of great importance, a restored relationship, a long-awaited blessing, a resolution to suffering, and the answer is delayed, it is easy to assume that God is not listening, that he has forgotten us. And yet, what we so often fail to understand is that waiting is not a sign of neglect. It is, in fact, one of the most profound ways that God works in our lives. Waiting is not merely an empty stretch of time in which nothing happens. It is a process, a shaping, a refining. Consider a seed buried in the ground. At first, there is nothing to be seen. The soil is undisturbed, the surface unchanged. Days pass, then weeks, and still there is no evidence of growth. To the impatient observer, it would seem as though nothing were happening at all. And yet, beneath the soil, the seed is undergoing a transformation. Roots are stretching downward, drawing in the nourishment needed for what is to come. Slowly, unseen at first, life is forming, and then, in time, when the moment is right, the first shoot breaks through the surface. What seemed like endless stillness was, in fact, a period of preparation. So it is with us. When we pray and do not receive an immediate answer, it does not mean that God is inactive. His delays are not denials. Rather, they are seasons of preparation, of unseen work being done beneath the surface of our lives. We may not perceive it, but in the waiting, we are being stretched, strengthened, and prepared for what is to come. There are qualities that can only be formed in the waiting: patience, trust, endurance. These are not things we develop in times of ease, when every request is granted without delay. They are forged in the moments when we must cling to faith, when we must continue to believe in God's goodness, even when we cannot yet see His hand at work. It is often the case that what we desire is good, but we are not yet ready to receive it. A child may long to drive a car, but he must first learn, grow, and develop the responsibility needed to handle it. A farmer does not harvest his crops the day after planting, no matter how much he might wish to. There is a season for sowing, a season for tending, and only then a season for reaping. If the harvest comes too soon, it is wasted. If the answer to our prayers comes before we are ready, we may find ourselves unable to handle the very thing we asked for. God, in His wisdom, knows the perfect timing for all things. When He asks us to wait, it is not because He is withholding out of cruelty, but because He is ensuring that we receive what is best at the right moment. And yet, waiting is not merely about preparing us for an answer. Sometimes it is the waiting itself that changes us in ways we could never anticipate. There are prayers we begin with one desire, only to find, over time, that our hearts have been transformed. What we once thought was essential, we later see as unnecessary. What we once longed for above all else, we come to realize was far less important than we imagined. If every prayer were answered instantly, we would never have the opportunity to grow in wisdom, to gain perspective, to understand that sometimes what we think we need is far different from what we actually require. Waiting also teaches us reliance on God rather than on outcomes. If every request were met immediately, we might begin to see God only as a means to an end, a dispenser of blessings rather than the source of life itself. But when we wait, when we are pressed into seasons of uncertainty, we learn to seek Him not only for what He gives, but for who He is. We come to know Him in ways we never would have if every desire had been met on our own timeline. The waiting deepens our faith, draws us closer, teaches us to trust not in the fulfillment of our wishes, but in the One who holds all things in His hands. In time, when we look back, we often see with clarity what was hidden from us in the moment. We recognize the wisdom in the delays, the purpose in the waiting. We understand that what seemed like silence was in fact an answer far greater than we had imagined. And perhaps most importantly, we see that even in the waiting, even in the uncertainty, we were never truly alone. For God is not only present in the granting of our requests, He is present in every moment, working, shaping, and drawing us ever nearer to Himself.